Welcome back to History Snapshots, and today we're going to be talking about sources, or the different things historians look at to try to figure out what happened in the past. And throughout this video, I'll introduce you to sources and explain exactly what they are and the different types of sources we'll look at throughout the year. But as you go throughout the video, the most important thing to keep in mind is this question: how do we learn about the past? Okay, so keep that question in the back of your mind and make sure that you can answer it at the end of this video. Also, before you exit out of this video, make sure that you, number one, define all highlighted terms, number two, answer the questions in the forum below, and number three, write down something that confuses you so you can bring it up in class tomorrow. Good luck, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, so one way historians look at the past is by studying written sources. And most people, when they hear the word written sources, they automatically think of books, like these historians reading these old books and trying to figure out what people were like hundreds of years ago. But that's not really true, because written sources are also letters, diaries, speeches, popular songs, poems, business records, or even campaign slogans. And it also, don't forget that written sources could be marks on ancient tombs or old calendars and even maps. Basically, if anything has writing on it, it's a written source, and it's going to be very helpful in trying to figure out how people lived in the past. We're going to explore two categories of written sources in this part of the video, and the first category of written source is a primary source, or a source that comes from the same time period as the event that is being described. Some examples of primary sources include letters, diaries, postcards, and newspapers. I think giving a real-world example makes it a little bit more clear. So let's take the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. Somebody sending a text message to a friend at the time of the bombing, that message would count as a primary source, right? Because it's describing an event that person is witnessing. Now, obviously, primary sources are really, really important to historians and very helpful for learning about the past because they're the words of people who actually lived through that event. Okay? And let's compare that to a secondary source. Alright? A secondary source is created later by people who studied the original sources. Okay? So those are usually books or textbooks or certain articles. Okay, so let's use the marathon example again. Police officers or historians or journalists who collected all those text messages, who collected all those pictures, studied everything that happened, and then put it together in an article. That article would be a secondary source. And it is, again, very valuable for a historian, but not quite as helpful as a primary source because those people didn't live through the event themselves. Now, as helpful as the written record may be for historians when it comes to learning about the past, there's one major problem with the written record, and that is it is dependent upon the invention of writing. And I know that's just hard for us to understand, but at one point in history, writing did not exist. And that turns out that before the year 3000 BC, there was no writing. The writing just didn't exist in the world. And we're going to talk more about this later, but what you need to know is at one point in time there was no written records. So you may be asking, what did historians do to learn about the past that before the time of writing? Well, they use a method of prehistory, which is learning about prehistoric societies relying completely on non-written sources. And one really important non-written source that historians look to when they're trying to learn about very, very old civilizations is called the oral tradition. And the oral tradition is the legends, myths, and beliefs passed on by word of mouth from generation to generation. So over time, these stories, right, are passed down from generation to generation, and a historian looks at it to try to learn about really old societies. A popular example of oral tradition is Homer's Odyssey, right? That was a very popular oral tradition that people told each other, and eventually Homer wrote it down. But before that, it was just a story passed on by word of mouth. In addition to using the oral tradition, historians, when they are trying to learn about prehistoric societies before the time of writing, will use other non-written sources, such as fossils or the remains of imprints of once living plants or animals. And I think we're all pretty familiar with fossils, right? And that's what the picture to the right shows, a fossil of an animal from prehistoric times. And they'll also look at artifacts or objects made by humans. Some examples of artifacts are coins and jewelry. Okay, and so a historian or an archaeologist, if they're trying to learn about a really old society, will dig some of these things up, and they'll be able to figure out what that society valued based on the artifacts or what the fossil records show them. And I think this is pretty easy for us to relate to, right? Because if somebody came and was trying to learn about our society thousands of years from now, and they were digging in the dirt, they may think that we value pop culture and technology and communication based on some of the artifacts that they would find from our society today. Okay, so we've done a lot of exploring about how historians look at the past and how they learn about prehistoric societies, whether it's by using the written record or oral tradition or even looking at artifacts. But it doesn't stop there. The important thing is, when historians collect all this evidence, they have to put it together and interpret it and try to figure out, why is it important? What does it tell me about society? What does it tell me about what people like to do in their free time? Things like that. So that's some of the important questions we're going to be asking ourselves in class. The one thing I want you guys to take away from this video is that think of historians like a good detective. No matter what, if it's written tradition or oral tradition or fossils, artifacts, no matter what, they're trying to get as much information as they can, put all that information together, and come out with the best results and try to figure out how people lived in the past and why that's important for us today. Alright, so I know that was a lot of information, but there you have it. This concludes this episode of History Snapshots, but before you X out of this video, make sure that you, number 1, define all highlighted terms, number 2, answer the questions on the forum below, and finally, number 3, write down something that confused you so you can bring it up in class tomorrow. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.